What if I told you that North America, from Alberta, Canada, down to northern Mexico, and from coast to coast, was once full of buffalo? So many that it's hard to estimate, but most experts say between 30 and 40 million. And what if I told you that mass slaughter of the buffalo in the latter half of the 1800s would dwindle their population to just around 500, with some estimates being even lower? And what if I told you that this is ultimately a story of hope and resilience, not just of the buffalo, but also of Indigenous Americans? My name is Katie, and this is Yapping About History, a podcast where we yap about the past so that the present makes more sense. What I am is the Indian who can't die. I am the worst dream America ever had. Yup, we're getting right into this one. This week's episode is based on another historical horror book that I have just read called The Buffalo Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones. Dun, 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 dun. Now, this was my first Stephen Graham Jones book, and I have to say, I can't wait to read more. This is such an amazing book. And I know I said last week that The Reformatory was probably going to be my favorite book of the year, but then I proceeded to read The Buffalo Hunter right after, and now I'm going to say that these two books are probably going to be tied for my favorite books that I read last year. I also think I found a new genre that I really like, historical horror. Now, I don't want to give too much away because I want everyone to read this, but I really liked a review from Gabriel Iglesias, who does a way better job of describing the book than I could. So here's a part of it. Quote, "It's 2012 and they find the diary of Arthur Beaucarnet, a Lutheran pastor, stuffed behind a wall. The document, written in 1912, soon becomes a detailed chronicle of several massacres, a bizarre transformation, countless battles, and endless violence. Meanwhile, not as a background to the action, but as a present vital character, Jones centers Blackfeet culture and history. That's when the magic enters the story. Moments later, horror follows. The diary, written by Beaucarnet, aka Three Persons, and Good Stab, a man confessing his sins, is an amalgamation of history, revenge, and the supernatural, full of brilliant prose, carried by two very distinctive and often clashing voices. In his way, Jones has not only chronicled Blackfeet culture, but has also spoken through the characters against the flawed monolith known as the Native American experience. In The Buffalo Hunter, the author goes back in time, digs his feet into history, and spins a spellbinding yarn about one of the bloodiest, most significant parts of this country's history." End quote. And I couldn't have said it better myself. And like any good historical fiction, there are many historically accurate events and details in The Buffalo Hunter. And I don't know about you, but I'm the type of person that when I read or watch something that says based on a true story or that it's historical fiction, I am going to be looking into things as I go along, which is exactly what I did for this book as well. And I thought I'd share some of the things I've learned. I'm probably going to break this into a two-parter and just do one topic per episode. And you wouldn't have had to read the book in order to understand what's going on. So without further ado, let's get into part one's topic. And that is the buffalo, as you may have guessed from the intro. And a fun fact before we get too deep into it, the North American buffalo is actually a bison, and its scientific name is bison. Pretty creative. They can also be found in different parts of Europe. True buffaloes, like water buffalo, are found in South Asia and Africa. And also, have you seen water buffalo swimming underwater? Talk about nightmare fuel. The switch up came from early white explorers who called the bison buffalo, and the terms are still used pretty interchangeably today in the US in reference to the bison. I feel pretty fortunate to have been able to see buffalo out in the wild, once at the northern rim of the Grand Canyon, and the other time was at the Wichita Mountain Wildlife Refuge in Comanche County, Oklahoma. The wildlife refuge was so beautiful, and I got to see a lot of buffalo and also got to see a lot of longhorn steer. Now, the really cool and interesting thing about this particular wildlife refuge is that it's a very sacred place to multiple Plains tribes, and the most sacred spot being Mount Scott. It is said that this mountain is where the buffalo came from, and I feel honored that I got to explore this place, and I actually ran up Mount Scott when I was there. But remember, this is Oklahoma, so mountains aren't very tall. But anywho, keep Mount Scott in this area in your memory palace because it's going to come up again in the story. I'll post links to all the sources I used in the episode description, but I did want to mention that there is a PBS Ken Burns documentary called The American Buffalo, and it's really, really good. It's into two parts, and I highly recommend sitting down and watching it. One of the historians in it said that you have to wait until the end of the story because ultimately it's a story about hope. And I know it's going to get really dark, but I want you to hold on to that hope because we'll get there in the end. Buffalo were extremely important to the Northern Plains indigenous nations, and not just as a food source. They had tribal histories, cultures, traditions, and spiritual lives that were all connected deeply to the buffalo in a reciprocal relationship. The buffalo provided food and other resources for the Northern Plains people, and they in turn honored and cared for the buffalo through ceremonies and other cultural protocols. For more than 10,000 years, the buffalo evolved alongside the indigenous people. And the buffalo were just as important to the Great Plains. They basically shaped the area and kept it thriving. From their grazing, their dung, and their migration patterns, this all helped keep the soil and the plant life thriving. And the way that they would roll around on the ground, which is called wallowing, made little indentations into the earth where water could pool for drinking and for other wildlife and flora to flourish. And their almost complete removal of the landscape can be viewed as a significant contributing factor to the Dust Bowl in the 1920s and 30s, directly from not having them there to upkeep the prairies, and also indirectly because you had farmers on the land farming in maybe not the greatest of ways in the area that the buffalo once roamed. The buffalo are called Ini or Iniwa in Blackfoot, Tatanka in Lakota, Ivan in Navajo, Kutz in Paiute. Sorry if the pronunciations are not 100% correct. I tried really hard to look up YouTube videos of indigenous people speaking about their tribes, but I wanted to put all those names out there just to show how many people relied on the buffalo. Generally speaking, the word buffalo is used in a cultural context for indigenous people, and bison is used more in the scientific community. So I'm going to be sticking with buffalo in honor of that, but if you hear me say bison, just know that it's the same animal. Now I want to read a quote by John Fire Lame Deer, a Sioux medicine man. He said, quote, "The buffalo was a part of us, his flesh and blood being absorbed by us until it became our own flesh and blood. Our clothing, our teepees, everything we needed for life came from the buffalo's body. It was hard to say where the animals ended and the human began," end quote. All right, you know that we have to start off with background before we get into it. So what was happening in the US in the mid to late 1800s when mass buffalo hunting really took off? Well, by this time we have already seen the completion of the Trail of Tears, which was a result of legislation called the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which was signed into law by our favorite president, Andrew Jackson, she says with sarcasm. This act authorized forced relocation of indigenous tribes living in what we would refer to now as the South to Indian Territory, which was mostly the area that we think of as Oklahoma, that is Oklahoma now, in order to expand white settlements back in the South. This act also claimed to provide the resettled indigenous with financial and material assistance in order to start over, and that they would be under the protection of the U.S. government forever, which kind of sounds more like a threat than safety to me. But by the end of Jackson's presidency, he had signed around 70 removal treaties, which impacted about 50,000 indigenous people. Some tribes resettled without protest, but some refused, most famously being the Cherokee Nation. Now, we could do a whole episode on the Trail of Tears, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but by the end of the forced removal of indigenous people, around 3,000 to 4,000 Cherokees had died on the way. The mid-1800s is also the time of Manifest Destiny, which you might have heard about in history class. This is the ideology that Americans were destined to extend the nation across the entire continent. We talked a little bit about this in the Bear Flag Rebellion episode, but between the 1840s and 1870s, the U.S. gained almost 1.5 million square miles of land, mostly through the war with Mexico, but also from purchases and treaties. This included the Oregon Territory, Texas, land that is now not Canada, land that is now California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and then parts of Wyoming, Colorado, and also Alaska. Now I think it would be a good time to do one of my favorite quotes from the Buffalo Hunter, and it is, "You can't stop a country from happening, Good Stab." And then Good Stab says, "But we were already a nation. We didn't ask you to come." And I mean, By the 1850s, the Great Plains was inhabited by numerous tribes such as the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, Lakota, Blackfeet, Arikara, the Ponca, and Cree. The tribes were thriving and there were plenty of buffalo, but soon gold was discovered in the West and white settlers began to flood the plains. Western expansion meant that the buffalo and the indigenous people could no longer roam freely. Along with expansion, the U.S. government was increasingly trying to push all indigenous people onto reservations to limit their land and freedom of movement. This was also the time of the Transcontinental Railroad, which further drove out the buffalo and indigenous Americans. And then the Homestead Act of 1862 was passed. This allowed any adult citizen or intended citizen who had, quote, never borne arms against the U.S. government, end quote, aka fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. This allowed them to claim 160 acres of government land out west. There were some stipulations, like they were required to live and improve on the land that they were on, and after 5 years, the land was theirs outright with only a small registration fee. And it didn't seem to help small farmers and homesteaders like Congress thought, because most of the land was bought up by speculators, cattle owners, loggers, and the railroads, aka people that already had wealth. Sound familiar? This was actually how Oklahoma eventually became a U.S. state. After pushing indigenous people into Oklahoma as Indian territory, the U.S. government broke treaties and pushed them further and further into smaller areas, then allowed white settlers into the now unassigned lands in the late 1880s, which came to be known as the Land Run or Land Rush of 1889. I actually visited the Land Run Monument in Oklahoma City while visiting family over Christmas break, and I hope to have a little history travel blog up on it soon, so stay tuned for that. And in 1871, Congress passed the Indian Appropriations Act, which made indigenous tribes legally designated wards of the federal government, ending the practice of treating them as sovereign nations, which, among other things, made it impossible for them to negotiate treaties. And by being wards of the state, this meant that they weren't allowed to leave the reservation without permission. However, most of the agreements with the Plains tribes allowed them to leave the reservations to hunt buffalo, but only as long as there was sufficient numbers of buffalo, which kind of seems like they had some ideas in mind, which we'll find later on. They did. All right, so what happened to the buffalo? Now that we know a little bit more about the indigenous people's connection with the buffalo and what was going on with the U.S. government indigenous tribe relations during this time, now let's talk about a little bit more about the buffalo. As we established earlier, the indigenous tribes in the Great Plains were very connected to the buffalo, and not just for food and supplies, but also spiritually and culturally. Buffalo once roamed all across North America, and it's hard to estimate for sure, but the numbers are anywhere between 20 to 40 million buffalo. There were a few reasons for the uptick in buffalo hunting leading up to this time, one of which was the increasing popularity of buffalo hides used for clothing and blankets in the eastern US and Europe. There was also a new technique of tanning the hides into leather that was developed in Europe, and this leather was used in different machinery parts as industrialization began to ramp up. About 6 million hides were exported from 1871 to 1883, which would be from almost 9 million buffalo. And the discrepancy in numbers there is because sometimes buffalo were killed, but then the hide would be ruined from the shot where it was, or maybe the hunter messed up on skinning the buffalo. So there's estimates between, like, for every one hide, it could have been like 2 to 3 times as many buffalo were killed in order to get that one hide. That's why there's discrepancy in the numbers. One article I read said that you could argue that the leather belts and industrialization aspect was the main driver of the almost complete slaughter of tens of millions of buffalo. Another reason was the rebuilding stage after the Civil War. The demand for beef, hides, and tallow dramatically increased as the U.S. started to rebuild its economy and industrial base. In a similar vein, the growing middle and upper classes had a nearly insatiable appetite for beef, and the post-war economic boom gave them the buying power to afford it. However, the ranchers out in Texas couldn't satisfy this demand, so they had to expand their cattle grazing areas into the plains, thereby pushing buffalo out of their habitat. The expansion of the railroad was also another factor in the demise of the buffalo and indigenous people, and that leads us to the most insidious reason for the mass slaughter of buffalo. It was used as a way to eliminate indigenous peoples and or to devastate them so badly that they would be forced to comply with whatever the U.S. government told them to do or told them where to go. Because in order to expand the railroad or the cattle grazing areas or to expand industrially, you need to, quote, get rid of indigenous people and buffalo. And that's when government officials started to see that if you got rid of the buffalo, you could also get rid of the indigenous people. And this is well documented. This isn't just a hypothesis that historians have. And here are what some of the government officials had to say during this time. Columbus Delano, who was Secretary of the Interior in 1873, said, quote, "I would not seriously regret the total disappearance of the buffalo from our western plains in its effect upon the Indians," end quote. Writing to his superior in 1881, General Phil Sheridan, a leader in the Indian Wars, made it clear, quote, "If I could learn that every buffalo in the northern herd were killed, I would be glad. The destruction of this herd would do more to keep Indians quiet than anything else that could happen. Since the destruction of the southern herd, which formerly roamed from Texas to the Plate, the Indians in that section have given us no trouble. If the Secretary of the Interior will authorize me to protect all other kinds of game other than buffalo in the far west, I will engage to do so to the best of my ability," end quote. And then another Army official, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge, told a hunter, quote, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone," end quote. And from there, the buffalo didn't stand a chance. With the Transcontinental Railroad completed in 1869, it was easier and faster to transport large amounts of hide, and the invention of more powerful rifles made it easier to kill the buffalo. And with the consent and the encouragement of the U.S. government, buffalo hunting became a popular sport. It was said that people would shoot buffalo from railroad cars as it went through the Great Plains. People describe this as its own sort of gold rush, where men would drop everything and invest all their savings into buffalo hunting supplies and then head out west. During the height of buffalo killing, you could make a shit ton of money as a hunter, so it makes sense why many people were out there to do it. Then later on, after most of the buffalo were killed, their bones ended up being very valuable for fertilization and sugar refining, and it was said that the Great Plains were littered with buffalo bones. I'm sure you've seen the pictures of the mountains of buffalo bones that are like 20 feet high, and those buffalo bones actually ended up being more valuable than their hides ever were. And a second rush went out on the plains to collect the bones, and that happened around like the 1880s. And with this hide harvesting, buffalo were often killed and skinned where they died, and their corpses were left to rot. And I feel like this was also done as an added insult to the indigenous tribes that not only did they revere the buffalo, they used every part of the animals. So just to see them out rotting had to have been a blow to the gut. It was interesting during the American Buffalo documentary, they had letters and writings from buffalo hunters who felt bad while killing all the animals, and some even had regrets after the fact. They knew on some level that it was wrong to kill so many, or at least be that wasteful to not even harvest the meat. And that's what I don't understand about the logic in terms of pure economics. If the buffalo were so valuable, it doesn't really make sense to completely eradicate your source of income. But I guess greed will do that to you. And greed plus racism by the people in charge probably stopped them from putting any limits on it. Hunters would hold competitions with each other to see who could kill the most buffalo in a certain amount of time. And this is actually where the legend of Buffalo Bill comes from. You may have heard about Buffalo Bill. We'll talk about him for just a little bit. He is most known for his 4-hour-long Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, where he would go town to town, and he even toured in Europe, recreating scenes from life out in the Wild West, including shootouts with Indians and buffalo hunting. And yes, he traveled with real buffalo and would pay real indigenous people to participate in the show. This show would end up running for 30 years between 1883 and 1913, but it ended with Buffalo Bill declaring bankruptcy and selling off pieces of the show to make money. He was born as William Frederick Cody on February 26, 1846 in LeClaire, Iowa, and then moved with his family to Kansas. In 1864, he enlisted in the 7th Kansas Volunteer Cavalry and fought for the Union in the Civil War. And then in 1867, he started working for the Union Pacific Railroad in Kansas as a meat procurer for the construction crew. And this is when and where he ends up getting the nickname Buffalo Bill. He would deliver 12 buffalo a day. And estimates say that he killed more than 4,000 buffalo in one 8-month period. His skill as a guide and a horseman caught the eye of Lieutenant General Sheridan, which we had just quoted earlier. He was hired as a chief of scouts for the U.S. 5th Cavalry. recovery. He did this for 4 years and was part of several raids and battles with indigenous people. Although it took about 100 years to eliminate about half the bison population, the second half was killed in just 10 years. So that's anywhere between like 10 to 20 million buffalo killed in 10 years. That is the extent of the slaughter that we're talking about. It's insane. In the 1870s, more buffalo were killed than in any other decade in history. The 3 years of 1872, 73, and 74 were the worst. According to one buffalo hunter who based his calculations on first-hand accounts and shipping records, 4.5 million buffalo were slaughtered in that 3-year period alone. By January 1st, 1889, there were just 456 purebred bison left in the U.S., and 256 of them were in captivity, protected in Yellowstone National Park, and a handful of other sanctuaries. And there's a Kiowa legend that goes that the last of the surviving buffalo all walked together to Mount Scott in the Wichita Mountains and walked into a magical spot of the mountain to be safe, but never to be seen again. Remember, this is the sacred mountain where it is said that buffalo came from. And so I think that's just like a really beautiful but sad legend that they knew to go to, like all the remaining buffalo met up and knew to go to Mount Scott to be protected. All right, so here's where the hope comes in. In part 2 of the Ken Burns documentary, it goes into greater detail, but now we're going to talk about the buffalo's comeback. And it's really a hodgepodge of a handful of random people along with the buffalo's own resilience that truly end up saving the buffalo. I'm not going to go into all those people, so you really should go watch the documentary because it goes into in-depth into how each person contributed. One of the more ironic people that kind of sort of helped save the buffalo was Buffalo Bill himself. When millions of people went to see the buffalo up close in his Wild West shows, they became an endearing creature and began to become a symbol of the West. And all the people that went to the show got to see them up close. And I think it started to kind of finally sink in what was happening. It's hard to look tragedy in the face and not be moved by it. Because by the end, these were the few buffalo remaining and they actually got to see them. As bison were notably vanishing by the 1860s, public outcry prompted some states to pass laws to protect them, but enforcement was lacking and the massacre continued. The earliest efforts to rescue buffalo began in the 1860s when a handful of private citizens independently began to capture and shelter them, saving the species from extinction. And these buffalo served as a foundation stock for most of the modern public and private bison herds today. There were also a few naturalists and homesteader rancher types, particularly one woman and her former hide hunting husband, and they were Molly and Charles Goodnight, and a eugenics embracing former head of the Smithsonian, William Hornaday, and they all took a few calves and started raising their own small herds. Hornaday would go on to co-found the Bronx Zoo, and he had some buffaloes as one of the animals on display, and he actually got them from the Goodnights. And in the 1870s and 1880s, hundreds of buffalo occupied Yellowstone National Park. Despite the presence of the first U.S. cavalry soldiers to protect the wildlife, poaching of buffalo continued until Congress passed the Lacey Act in 1894. This legislation authorized prosecution of people in Yellowstone that were killing or removing wildlife from the park. And in 1905, the American Bison Society was formed to support bison recovery efforts, which compelled Congress to establish several public bison herds at the wildlife refuges and game preserves and national parks. President Teddy Roosevelt was closely involved in this group, and he was a big advocate for land and animal preservation in general, but particularly the buffalo. He had actually tried to go on a buffalo hunt in the 1880s, and he saw firsthand how few buffalo were left, and he knew something needed to be done to help keep the buffalo from going extinct. The American Bison Society disbanded relatively quickly after being established because they felt like they had succeeded in saving the bison from extinction. However, they were reestablished in 2005 to help advance the ongoing restoration of bison to our lands and culture. Let's talk about the long-term effects of the lack of buffalo on buffalo-reliant indigenous peoples. Besides the obvious immediate devastation of indigenous peoples who relied on the buffalo for food and other types of survival, a combined study by economists from Emory University, the University of Toronto, and the University of Victoria show that they have also suffered major long-term effects. One of the lines that stuck out to me in the documentary was, quote, "The rifle shot today, but killed tomorrow," end quote. And that's such a great summary of the lasting effects of nearly killing all of the buffalo. One major effect seen was that within one generation, those most impacted by the buffalo slaughter lost 1 inch in height, which is pretty dramatic for one generation. By the early 1900s, they show that the child mortality rate of bison-dependent indigenous nations was 16 percentage points higher, and the probability of a working-age male reporting an occupation was 19 percentage points lower compared with indigenous nations that were never reliant on bison. And income per capita remained 25% lower on average for bison-reliant nations compared to other nations through the mid-1900s to today. And this could not be explained by the differences in factors such as agricultural productivity, self-governance, or application of the Dawes Act in 1887, which authorized the breakup of reservation land into small allotments parceled out for individual ownership. So the fancy economists and all their studies and statistics like ruled out all these things. And they could say with a certain level of confidence that these differences are because of the lack of buffalo. Here's what one of the researchers said on why studies like this are important. Quote, "One role of economists is to provide quantitative evidence that people can turn to when trying to design more effective policies. By providing data that benchmarks disparities among bison-reliant people and the sources and evolution of these disparities, we hope to support efforts to improve the situation." End quote. So what is the state of the buffalo today? Well, I think one of my favorite, albeit bittersweet parts of the story is that in 1905, the Wichita Forest and Game Preserve was created, and in 1907, it became the first public lands to have buffalo reintroduced to it. And this is the same place that it was said that the last of the buffalo disappeared. And so then for it to be the first place for them to be reintroduced, yep, I cried when I got to that part of the documentary. And a full circle moment, those buffalo were from the Bronx Zoo, which were originally brought to the Bronx Zoo by the Goodnights mini herd, which were from some of the last wild buffalo. And what an all-about Kismet symbolic event. Those Bronx Zoo buffalo were sent by train halfway across the country to be at the zoo originally. And then those same buffalo were put on a train to go back to their ancestral and spiritually significant lands. I think it's really beautiful. However, I do want to acknowledge that this land the preserve was created on it used to be tribal land, but it was taken away from them. And the preserve is still ran by the US. So hence, that's why I kind of said it's bitter, the bittersweetness of it all. But don't worry, there are many tribes involved with the preservation of the buffalo. For example, there's the Intertribal Buffalo Council, whose mission is to, quote, "restore buffalo to the Indian country to preserve our historical, cultural, traditional, and spiritual relationship for future generations," end quote. The Intertribal Buffalo Council includes 86 tribes from 22 states, and the collective herd is around 20,000 buffalo. And you can donate to them if you want. Their website is itbcbuffalonation.org/donate. And don't worry, I'll put the link in the episode description. And this is from the National Park Service website. Quote, "Today, about 360,000 plains bison are privately owned as domestic livestock, while about 31,000 bison are stewarded as wildlife and publicly owned herds in the US and Canada. The Department of the Interior manages about 10,300 bison as wildlife, including approximately 8,000 bison in 10 national park units, 1,600 bison in 7 national wildlife refuges, and 700 bison on the Bureau of Land Management lands in Utah," end quote. And probably one of the most random herds of buffalo in the US is on a small island called Catalina off the coast of SoCal. They were brought over in the early 1920s for a movie that was being shot there, but the money fell through and the movie was never made. And then the buffalo were just kind of left there, and they actually actually did really well. And now the Catalina Island Conservancy looks after them and maintains the herd. They keep it around 150 to kind of keep balance between the ecology of the land because, they're not native to the island, and to kind of balance it out with the tourism there. I just thought that was a little fun fact for you. And then in the 2023 Inflation Reduction Act, $25 million was pledged to restore bison across the US. There's actually a really good mini documentary on TikTok, and you can also see it on YouTube. The TikTok is at ParksDan, ParksDan, or on YouTube at Watch Park Vibes. It's really good, and it kind of it goes into more detail about how people are trying to reintroduce the buffalo into the wild. And what does that mean? What does that look like? It's really interesting. And in 2016, the North American bison was declared the national mammal of the United States. National Bison Day has been observed annually on the first Saturday in November since 2012. Although the story of the buffalo slaughter is a devastating one and one that is wrapped up in some of the US's darkest periods, I also believe it is a story of resilience and hope. The buffalo were nearly killed to extinction, but through multiple conservationist efforts by intertribal groups and large wildlife protection organizations, and from a handful of people that took calves in the late 1800s, great efforts have boosted the conservation herds to about 3,000. And one of my favorite facts about the buffalo is that they choose to face storms head on and walk through them. And this is, metaphors on metaphors, symbolism on symbolism. The buffalo show that the easiest way to get through hard times is to literally face them head on and then move through them. Scientifically speaking, this actually minimizes the amount of time that they have to be in the storm versus an animal that, just kind of hunkers down. Those animals have to endure the entirety of the storm. And I think this is a really good mindset to hold on to and to remember when things get tough. Be like the buffalo. And so I wanted to end the episode talking about this theme of hope. We see it with the buffalo. We see it with Indigenous people. And I think it can be helpful to talk about hope in this day and age when it's kind of rough outside. I was just listening to an interview with Ken Burns about his recent documentary on the American Revolution. And when he was asked about having optimism or hope in our current political climate, he talked about how the Declaration of Independence includes the pursuit of happiness as one of our inalienable rights, and that we should focus on the word pursuit. Things may not be going well now, but we have to maintain hope and optimism in order to be in pursuit of a better government, a better way of life, etc. And that's why I think it's so important to examine all aspects of history, and that learning about the darker parts isn't a bad thing. It's necessary in order to see how we got to this point in the present, but I also think that there were always little slivers of hope, resilience, and perseverance to be found in those dark points in history. Yes, we can acknowledge what happened to the Buffalo Indigenous people was horrific, violent, and fueled by greed and racism, but in studying these times, the people who stood up for what was right, the people who helped their neighbor, the people who took small actions like taking a couple calves in, those people start to pop out from the corners of the history books. It might be a little bit harder to find them, but they're definitely there. And as hard as the US government tried to eliminate Indigenous peoples and the buffalo, they are both still around today, and we can look to their stories of survival for hope in times of darkness. I know things are rough right now, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed and discouraged. Believe me, I've felt like that a lot lately. But having a disillusioned, discouraged population is what power-hungry authoritarians want, and we can't give that to them. And I'll leave you with a couple more quotes on hope. Hope is essential to any political struggle for radical change when the overall social climate promotes disillusionment and repair. And that's by Bell Hooks. I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means that you have agreed that human life is an academic matter, so I'm forced to be an optimist. I'm forced to believe that we can survive whatever we must survive. It's by James Baldwin. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Yappin' About History. I hope this episode is a reminder that what we do today will shape the stories that are told tomorrow. History isn't just something we remember, it's something we carry with us. And I'll see you next week where we'll continue our discussion of the Buffalo Hunter. Bye!